right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast, live here in San Francisco at RSA Conference. Vinnie Liu is with me. Vinnie's the CEO and co-founder of Bishop Fox. Vinnie has been in the security game for 2 decades somehow. I don't know how we've been around this long, but definitely an expert in on the offensive side of security, red teaming, pet testing, app security, the works. Today we're going to talk about largely threats to hospitals in the healthcare sector, and things that these folks are dealing with, and what the role, the place of offensive security has during an incident and part of response, etc. So Vinny's going to bring some insight there. Obviously, healthcare's had a huge target on their back from attackers, and experts like Vinny are seeing a lot of stuff as they have engagements with a lot of these organizations. So I'm looking forward to his insights. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Good to see you, man.
Mike. Yeah, totally.
So before we get into the heart of the discussion, I'm curious always, like when I talk to somebody who does what you do, somebody hires you for an engagement, are they kind of nervous still about bringing in a red teamer, an offensive security person like yourself?
Yeah, I think too. There's always a little bit of nerves when you go in. You don't know what you're going to find, and so there is a bit of that. I would say over the last few years, it's become a lot more normalized, a lot more commonplace, and now it's less common for security professionals and people in our industry to be nervous about it because they see it as like a very positive thing.
Sure.
They're like, yes, I want you to come in and I want you to actually help me know where my vulnerabilities are, convince others within the organizations that we need to get work done or we need to make some changes. But more often it's the engineering or other groups that ultimately have to fix or may not want to receive the bad news or maybe less familiar with it that are resistant to it. And typically where we have to persuade people, or not even persuade, but put them at ease about what we're going to do is those second line organizations that we'll be working with.
And I mean, from my perspective, just hearing it anecdotally, these organizations get a really thick report from somebody like you guys, and a lot of times they don't take any action on it or minimal action on it. Is that changing at all, or is that a fair statement just to begin with?
I'd tell you 2 things. I think the reports are both getting thicker and they're getting thinner at the same time.
Yeah.
So you're seeing kind of a bifurcation in the market of what you'll get. So there are a lot of organizations companies that will go out and do a lot of automated work, produce a lot of largely unverified but potential issues, and that's where you get those really big reports. You get hundreds of pages of vulnerabilities, and what we're finding within large organizations, and I see it here at RSA as well, the challenge that they have is how do I prioritize, how do I validate so many vulnerabilities coming in from so many different sources, and that's you see a lot of companies that are popping up to deal with that.
Sure.
Right, and that's one problem set that there are different schools of thought around.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing those organizations that have been really consistent about their testing, that have been rigorous, that have put in place SDLC programs. A lot of those vulnerabilities are actually we're seeing fewer and fewer of those, and what that's doing is also raising the bar, so that the vulnerabilities you do find typically are the more sophisticated, the more complex, the more interesting ones, really for us to be able to exploit, requires a different level of skill in order to identify. So we're seeing both. We're seeing both of those things happen. But the market in general for that is expanding.
Right. I mean, it may not necessarily be in scope for you, but are you seeing organizations look at vulnerabilities and okay, I can't just look at whether it's a 10 or a 9 or an 8 or whatever? I mean, are they bringing in other factors in terms of remediation?
Yeah. I would say that organizations today are moving. Look, the vendor provided severity score or the CVSS rating is one element of their consideration, and in some cases, right, when you don't have the time to look at the additional context, you're going to have to rely on it. But by and large, we're seeing a lot of companies say, well, yes, this might be rated a CVSS 9, but what does it actually mean in our environment? Is the system connected to anything truly meaningful, or is it just, it was a random server that was left open, there's nothing important on it, so we can triage this as a lower priority.
Yeah. So I know we said we were going to talk about healthcare largely. Just kind of characterize what security leaders are kind of stressed about these days? I know like ransomware is pretty unrelenting across that sector overall, but I mean, you're on the front lines with these guys. What are they telling you?
Ransomware is involved in a very high percentage of the breaches that we're involved in. And what's interesting, and of course I think we're going to potentially touch on this topic, but breach is an interesting area where offensive security or proactive security testing typically hasn't been an area. Normally you call the firefighters,
right,
and the incident responders, but I would say that social engineering and that type of phishing and whatnot, that's a very common entry point that we're seeing today in incidents. And if I'm projecting, and if you're going to ask me about the future of where that's going, I don't think it's as commonplace yet, but I think a very serious concern is the use of deepfakes, and the sophistication of the technology and the availability of the technology is getting to the point where it is impressive and it's effective. I think the question will be, as we begin to solve the problem, or as we become more effective at blocking today's common techniques for business email compromise and phishing and so forth, when will they begin to shift over?
Yeah. So you're seeing that more of kind of a social engineering threat, just kind of that initial vector.
Yes. Yeah. Our clients across the board are starting to ask the question of like, how vulnerable would we be? Because they're trying to get ahead of it, which is great because it shows an appetite for being more proactive.
Sure. All right, so let's get into the heart of it. I mean, like you said, you're going to call the firefighter when the house is on fire, not necessarily somebody who knows how it might have been started. Just like, tell me how these engagements are happening. Wow.
Yeah, so a trend that we've seen in the last year or two in anywhere from the Fortune 10 to the Fortune 500 is the need to restore trust with your customers and your partners. So, yeah, you've had a fire in your apartment, but do you have somebody checking the other apartments, right? The other applications, the other services that you're providing to demonstrate, hey, there's no fire in these, right? And also, as part of an incident, our offensive testing or our proactive security testing is being brought in to ensure that, okay, there may be an active incident. You've got active threat inside your organization. We're about to shut them off. There's a moment where you shut them off and you pull the cord and you think you're going to lock them out.
Yeah.
You need to make sure they haven't already got a backup plan on how to get back into your system. So oftentimes we get deployed alongside the firefighters, the incident responders, in order to ensure secondary or tertiary attack vectors can't be taken advantage of. Because if there was a fire in one apartment, there might be kindling in the others that could be used. So we're deployed during an incident in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're also now seeing is that as part of the trust restoration process and the trust maintenance process. So where we see that happening is organizations are being, companies are now with supply chain almost requiring, I wouldn't say demanding, but very insistent that companies that have had incidents demonstrate that they have not only put out the fire, but that it's safe to use going forward.
Okay.
And that it's been tested. And that's kind of where we've been brought in a number of situations to provide that assurance as an independent third party. People don't want the self-verification or self-assessment anymore.
But are you actually brought in during incidents while response is going on?
Yeah, in some cases. Yeah, especially if the incident is severe enough and that there's the threat of ongoing attack. Like ransomware is a great example where the nature of your relationship with an attacker has actually fundamentally changed. So, it used to be somebody would break in, they'd steal your data, and then they would go sell it on the dark web. With ransomware, they've broken in, and they expect to have a dialogue with you and to negotiate with you about what your ransomware payment is going to be. And it's not just hey, here's what you need to pay me, and that's it. There's oftentimes like, you need to pay me by this deadline, and if I don't feel like you're cooperating, the ransomware groups will actually then say, I'm moving up your deadline because I think you're trying to get out of this in some way. You only have 48 hours instead of 72 now left on the clock. So there's that relationship with your attacker is actually changing. which is wild.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, I was just talking to Mikko Hipponen here and about, he did a talk on the first 10 years of ransomware. And as we're talking, I'm like, this evolution from just 2014 to today, ransomware as a service, everything that's, makes up this environment now, the acceleration has been unreal.
Absolutely. And the business model is changing as
Right.
well, right? It's, and I bet Mikko probably talked about this, but it's not just, hey, we've encrypted your systems, we'll decrypt them so you have the ability to operate, but we might also sell it. So
Right.
you gotta, that's the fee for us not selling it. And what you're seeing is that there's a whole ransomware supply chain, if you will, and everybody's got to get paid.
Right.
And if not everybody's going to get paid, then your initial negotiation might result in secondary or payments to teams that.
The whole data theft part of it too, and that extortion component, the extra double extortion component of it is just awful. I mean, their hands are tied in many cases in terms of payment, in terms of
I mean, it's you're up against the wall, and obviously then there was the incident with the one company that had that had been reported to regulatory agencies for having a breach, for not having reported the breach quickly enough. They were reported by the ransomware gang,
right,
and because they're like to put additional pressure. They made a threat. The company tried to call their bluff.
Right.
They reported in the regulatory agency.
And there don't seem to be any red lines either. I mean, so many of these hospitals were hit during COVID, for example.
Yeah.
And that's just something that is just an extra element to this whole thing, too, obviously.
Right. Was it a meat processing plant or was it a hospital? They seem to be largely indifferent to the...
Exactly.
Yeah, very opportunistic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Are companies proactive about coming to you during incidents? Is this a word of mouth thing? Like, how is it happening?
I think it is more born out of the need to demonstrate security to their customers and partners. Because, if one of your 3 business lines has been impacted and it's a big impact and it's public, your customers in your second and third business that are working with your second and third business units, they don't want to be breached either.
Right.
And so now your responsibility to demonstrate proper security goes across your entire business, not just the one. And it's not just a one-time thing either, especially for the impacted assets or applications or services that you're providing. But now they want to know ongoing, and it's almost a customer-driven consent order, if you will. It's like you just have to start showing I got secure and I stayed secure as well.
Yeah. So are you seeing that the regularity of these assessments going up, I would imagine?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say there's a number, some of the more kind of the forward 25% of our customer base is really thinking about how do I continuously understand my attack surface? How do I continuously look for the vulnerabilities that attackers are going after? And that's been a large part of where we've shifted our effort and our solutions is to meet that customer demand.
And are the assessments as extensive each time? Like if you're doing X amount a year as opposed to 1 a year or 2 a year?
That's a great question because I think it's shifting. What we're finding is that you might do a larger initial review to get a baseline, but the more frequent nature of the testing to get ahead of bad guys, I mean, that's essentially what the game is today. It's a game of speed. Our job is to find the vulnerabilities before the threat actors can, and that requires more frequent, more consistent review, but in smaller bites. And it's not just doing the same thing over and over again. It's actually looking for the things. It's in a very threat-informed way.
Yeah.
Because attackers aren't looking for everything everywhere all at once. They're looking for the things that they know are most likely to be exploited because it's an ROI game for them.
Yeah. And how much are the users informing your engagements in terms of, I don't want to go here, I want to go there kind of thing?
User customers?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
To a degree. Some of it is just sort of what we're seeing in terms of the TTPs that our attackers are doing.
Yeah.
What I would say that one of the really interesting benefits of being an independent third party is that our customers, especially large enterprises that have more mature threat intelligence programs or vulnerability disclosure programs will share that information with us to say, we've been seeing this activity in our environment. Can you look for it? And oftentimes what we see in one area predicts the activity that will actually affect other large enterprises. And so there's a network effect to that just by the relationships that we have. And we've found it's been really effective because different people have different threat intel from different threat actor groups that we can then apply.
So can you share an example? Is that like a specific exploit or?
There's a handful of vulnerabilities, usually in people so one of our large what kind of industry would they be in? Like food and beverage. One of our large food and beverage customers actually. When we were doing work on their systems, we were testing their security against Log4j, right?
Okay.
And what we found was that their defensive mechanism that they had in place, the recommended solution provider, we could actually bypass that because of their specific system and configuration. And what we found from that was that, actually that global solution provider had it wrong for, like a third of the internet that they were protecting or whatever, right? And so that was actually feedback to the global security provider that they needed to fix their rules around it. This is like, Log4j timeframe.
Log4j,
right? But similarly, when we see vulnerabilities and exploits come through, we'll oftentimes get advanced access through that network. Another example is there was a vulnerability in a security product that they started seeing a lot of strange activity around. We got access to that vulnerability a few days in advance, and we were able to inform our other customers about that. And so there's a lot of days where we have like -2 or -3 days advance notice,
right?
Which is the game of,
Talk to me a little bit about kind of the complexity of healthcare environments, hospitals, etc. There's so much in terms of legacy stuff that's still running. Probably all the way back to XP, that stuff that's not supported anymore. How much of that are you seeing? How big of an issue is that? Does that complicate what you have to do?
Yeah, it does. It does, and it is both in terms of not just technology, which is where most people focus, but in terms of practice and the reality of delivering care. So when we think about it, there's healthcare environments where it is regulated by HIPAA, right? There's healthcare and protecting personal health information, and that's where a lot of people think about it. But then you have to think about the business of delivering care inside an actual clinical environment. And what you find inside a clinical environment is you've got devices that are FDA approved, that any upgrade or change to that device or upgrade needs to then be approved again. And so people are very reluctant to make any changes for those things, and that's why you wind up with XP and so forth that are there. Now you've also got the other consideration in delivering care of like, what's the most important thing inside a hospital? It's always going to be patient safety and patient health. So if they have a Post-it note on there, are they going to have two-factor authentication? Is there going to be a way to bypass that if you need to pull something up to deliver care? Like, you might have a Post-it note with the password to the system on that device because the security requirements say that it needs to be there. But if I need to deliver care immediately, there should be nothing stopping me from doing that because I forgot my badge or because I don't have my second factor on me. And so the practical reality is they will always prioritize patient safety before that. And that's just an angle that most people don't think about. Is like, you can have the latest operating system, you can have 2FA, you can have all of the things that you need, but at the end of the day, the patient's health is going to be paramount.
And that's, anecdotally, again, you hear from CISOs in hospitals and healthcare delivery organizations. It's just like it's this collision with physicians and nurses, and for good reason. Their job's patient safety, not worrying about the server crashing or whatever.
Exactly. So those are just a couple of the examples of the environmental challenges, and also like healthcare is really complex, and the interconnectivity in those environments is wild. It's essentially like clinical is like an OT environment for healthcare. Right. Those systems typically you don't touch, you don't mess with. They're really important. You kind of need uptime, and and then just the data that moves, or the interconnectivity of the data.
Yeah. And you kind of hinted at it too, like patching is almost impossible in this stuff because it's either going to go through the vendor or the FDA, and there's all kinds of weird approvals that have to happen.
Right.
And I'm sure you see that a lot too.
Yeah. Now, what I'm encouraged by, is medical device manufacturers and that type, and the FDA are taking that a lot more seriously.
Right.
They are definitely. I'm seeing a big improvement from where we were 5 to 6 years ago in that space, and so the work that we've done, and even I would say like less regulated areas, people are taking it more seriously, because I think consumers are starting to, even the direct-to-consumer type things, that people are paying attention to it, and then people are really caring about where that information goes.
How long does it take for, say you have a customer and you went in 2 years ago and it was a mess, whatever a mess means. How long does it take for you to see that kind of improvement? Is it a significant period of time before that things are kind of a little better?
I would say it can be industry dependent, and it can be customer dependent. The thing that and there's regulatory dependent as well. The customer driven requirements are oftentimes the ones that get the most speed.
Sure.
Followed by regulatory, depending on the industry.
Right.
But that's typically like, if you can't sell, you will solve that problem.
Right.
And that's where I think the reason we're being brought in to these incidents, both during and after and ongoing, is because these businesses want to maintain their ability, they maintain the trust with their customers, because that's their revenue source.
Yeah.
And understandably.
Do you, and I'm not entirely familiar with your entire customer base, but like the OT side of it, you brought it up, just the manufacturing side, the utilities, etc. Uptime's everything, safety's everything. Are they even less hesitant to kind of like, even if they need services from a company like yours, are they less willing to kind of engage? Even if you're on the IT side of the house, for example. Yeah. No, we work in both environments. We work in, critical infrastructure, power providers, power distribution, and factories, right? From frozen waffle factories to aircraft factories, right? Like you've seen it all, but I would say that the complexity in those environments is a lot more around how do you segment and isolate. It's less about hardening individual things, right? So I think the strategy there today is still about segmentation and isolation. Yeah. I think ransomware is the big concern that they have there more than anything else. Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of the bifurcation we see today. How much time do you spend understanding kind of like the nature of the attacker? I know you guys have to have be on your game about vulnerabilities and configurations and so forth, but understanding kind of the opponent, so to speak.
Yeah. I guess I'd describe it by saying all the moves are the same, but their payload of choice and the combination in which they do that is usually the same. It's like there's only so many ways you can punch and kick, but what combination are they performing in? And you have to study that aspect of it. Yeah. Right? And so that's kind of where the study comes in, is what are the adversaries, what game are they playing today? And what do we need to do to get ahead of that game?
And I don't know if you don't need to break it down into exact percentages, but like how often are you running into the state-sponsored versus kind of the criminal actor? And how often do you see those lines cross?
Those are more and more getting blurred. Yeah. Based on the way that, nation states plus nation-state sanctioned groups are operating. I would say the line between... There's a very gray area of people that break into things and people that find vulnerabilities. In that one day, maybe you're part of a ransomware gang that finds the initial entry point into an organization, and you sell that access to the people that then extort, right? And then they sell that data to the people that, release the data, right? That industrial version of ransomware. But that same skill set that allows you to do that type of initial entry is the same skill set that maybe you submit it to a vulnerability disclosure program instead, because there's a payout there.
Sure.
And if there isn't a payout, then you hand it over, right? So there's that skill set, that activity, the nation state to economically motivated to sort of even the lower levels, I think becomes a really interesting area where we're keeping a close eye on, you know, because now you have a lot of options of what you do with the vulnerabilities that you have. So what are organizations inviting in terms of risk?
From what perspective? From the...
Yeah. I think the tricky part to navigate is that when you have an attack surface, you are exposing yourself to any number of types of activities. You know, if you have vulnerability disclosure programs, you're encouraging people to come and attack you.
Right. And does that become an integrity issue? Like, how do you trust who's on the other side of that?
How do you trust who's on the other side of that?
Yeah.
And are the people vetting the people supposedly?
Right. I mean, I would imagine that's part
Are they
of
getting it 100% of the time? Are they getting it 80% of the time?
Right. Because then there's got to be like some competing interests there at some point in terms of, you know, getting paid or how many times you get paid for the same bug or...
Right, exactly. Or if you're not getting paid, do you then threaten to disclose to a regulator?
Right.
If you don't pay me.
Right.
It's not in scope. I don't care.
Right. Which we've seen with some ransomware actors, right?
Yeah.
Going right to the regulator.
Exactly. It's the same playbooks.
Yeah.
It's the same playbook. It's no secret
that
you can do that.
Right.
So why not?
Why not?
Why am I doing this?
Right.
For the good of the land? No, I'm doing this because I'm trying to get paid.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think motivation and intent becomes a really important factor when you're thinking about, like, what are you inviting?
Right. Yeah, and like we're already a decade into bounties or even longer, and, you know, I don't think that's explored enough.
It's not explored enough, and I think there's obviously, like, you go into it and you think about, like, okay, like, and look, don't get me wrong, I think a lot of researchers are doing the right thing.
Sure.
And there's a lot of good results that can come out of that. But at the same time, there's always, it's people.
Yeah.
And people are a mix. And what risk are you introducing yourself to when you open that up?
Right.
And is everybody going to act honorably?
Probably not.
Probably not, right? Because you're dealing with the internet.
Right.
And you're doing it, and you're setting up a program specifically to go after, literally like mercenaries, right? Bounty hunters.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
They're going to go where the money is.
Right.
So
interesting times, man.
It is. It's changed a lot since we started.
It sure has. That was like one of the questions I asked Miko. It's like, you know, he's been doing it for 35 years, whatever it's been. And it's like, you know, you ever sit back and kind of look at this and like, wow, this is. It wasn't all about profit at the beginning. It was, you know, kids messing around, and look where we are now.
Right.
It's impacting national security, not just economic security.
Yeah. I mean, the way I described it when I got started, it was fighting for your corner of IRC.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And like internet turf wars.
Right.
So.
All right, man. That's a good place to leave it. It's
great
to see you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it. All right, man. Thanks.